In August of 1916, the Russian Empire poured concrete in a town most of Europe could not find on a map. Kovrov, Vladimir Province. A railway junction east of Moscow, chosen not for glory, but for distance from the German front and access to the rails that fed the war. The plan was simple on paper. Build a modern machine gun, works with Danish money, Danish machines, and a Danish design. Manufacture the Madsen light machine gun in Russian numbers. Solve, at last, the problem every army on the Eastern Front already understood. One shot at a time was not enough. Then the empire came apart. By 1918, the Danes were gone. They left with most of the tooling. The Madsen line that was supposed to arm a dying army never became a Russian weapon. What remained in Kovrov was an unfinished factory, empty machine beds, a half-trained workforce, and a country rewriting its own name. Into that wreckage walked a Tula gunsmith named Vasily Degtyarev, sent with his mentor, Vladimir Fedorov, to turn an abandoned foreign project into the first Soviet design bureau for automatic arms. What they built from that failure did not stay in Kovrov. Over the next century, guns that left those gates defined how the Red Army fought, how the Second World War sounded on the Eastern Front, and how half the world's irregular forces learned to put automatic fire into a squad. The pan-fed light machine gun that became the visual shorthand of the Soviet infantryman, the 12.7 that still rides technicals from old wars into new ones, the wartime submachine gun stamped out by the million, the anti-tank rifle rushed toward Moscow, and later, the belt-fed systems that outlived the state that ordered them. This is the story of a factory that was never supposed to carry a Russian name, a designer who started as a workshop hand, and the weapons that forced the plant to reinvent itself again and again. It is also the story of empty tooling in 1918, overtime in 1941, motorcycle lines in peacetime, unpaid invoices in the 1990s, and a name that still sits on the gate in Kovrov under a state corporation the founders could not have imagined. The factory explains how. Chapter 1. The plant that lost its owners. Chapter 1. The plant that lost its owners. Russia met the light machine gun the hard way. In 1904, on the edge of war with Japan, the Imperial Army tested the Danish Madsen and ordered a batch. Most of the guns did not arrive in time. Russian industry, for all its size, still ran on a narrow base. High-precision automatic weapons were not a cottage craft. For years, the serious capacity sat in Tula, and even Tula was built around heavier, slower problems than a gun a man could run with. The Great War made the gap impossible to ignore. Riflemen died in rows. Machine guns owned the ground between trenches. A light automatic that could move with the infantry was no longer a novelty. It was a requirement. So the empire did what empires do when time runs out. It bought help. In 1916, construction began at Kovrov for a dedicated machine gun plant, backed by a Danish syndicate that would supply equipment, engineers, and the Madsen design itself. On the 27th of August that year, the enterprise that would one day bear Degtyarev's name took its founding date. On paper, Russia was about to mass-produce a modern light machine gun on foreign machines under foreign supervision. Paper did not survive 1917. Revolution, then Civil War, emptied the project of its sponsors. Danish staff fled. Critical equipment went with them. The Madsen, the whole reason for the concrete and the rail spurs, never became the standard Russian or Soviet light machine gun. Kovrov was left holding a factory without a product line and a workforce without a finished process. That should have been the end of the story. Abandoned war plants litter the 20th century. Instead, in early 1918, the new authorities sent Vladimir Fedorov to Kovrov. Fedorov was already one of the few men in Russia who understood automatic rifles as a system, not a curiosity. He had designed a selective fire rifle around the Japanese 6.5mm Arisaka cartridge, a cleaner, lower recoil round than the rimmed Russian service cartridge. He believed the future belonged to volume of controlled fire, not heavier single shots. With him came a practical mechanic from Tula who had spent his life close to the metal, Vasily Alexeyevich Degtyarev. Degtyarev was born in Tula on the 2nd of January 1880. He was not a staff college product. He was a factory worker at the Tula Arms Plant, a man who learned weapons by building and repairing them. In 1905, he married. By the time he reached Kovrov, he was 38, experienced, and still largely invisible to anyone who only read officer lists. At the unfinished plant, he started as a master and constructor-inventor under Fedorov's experimental shop. In the chaos of the Civil War years, that shop became something the old empire had never quite managed to institutionalize. A dedicated Soviet bureau for automatic small arms, sitting on the floor of a factory that had been built for someone else's gun. They tried to make Fedorov's automatic rifle work in production. They studied foreign light guns. They learned what Russian industry could actually hold to tolerance when steel, coal, and skilled labor were all in doubt. Degtyarev's early influence was not a famous patent on the gate. It was bench habit. File the part that fails. Accept the cartridge the depots already hold. Design for the machinist you have, not the machinist you wish you had. The early Soviet state did not need a perfect weapon. It needed a weapon it could make. The Madsen plant had failed as a Madsen plant. What grew in its place was more dangerous: a school. Kovrov was no longer a Danish franchise. It was becoming a Soviet machine gun works in search of a gun that would justify the walls. The first answers would fail in public. The next one would feed an army. Chapter 2. The Gunsmith from Tula. Chapter 2. The Gunsmith from Tula. Before Degtyarev could arm an army, the plant had to survive being useful in a system that destroyed people for being the wrong kind of useful. The 1920s at Kovrov were not a montage of clean prototypes and parade grounds. They were arguments about cartridges, weight, floor space, and whether the Red Army would fight the next war with clever foreign ideas or with the rimmed 7.62 by 54 millimeter round already filling every depot from Leningrad to Vladivostok. Fedorov wanted the 6.5. Degtyarev worked inside that argument as the man who had to make metal obey. The logistics system wanted what it already had. In the end, logistics won. That single decision shaped every light machine gun Degtyarev would build for the next 20 years. The rimmed Russian cartridge was powerful, long-ranging, and hostile to neat box magazines. It liked to snag. It demanded feed geometry that punished designers who thought in straight lines. The first major Soviet attempt at a light machine gun did not come from Degtyarev's clean sheet. It came from cutting down what Russia already knew. The Maxim Tokarev took the heavy Maxim and tried to make it portable, the same general idea Germany had chased in the last war. Troops hated the early batches. It was still heavy. It was still complicated. Improvements made it less like a Maxim and more like a manufacturing headache. The Army's verdict was blunt. Little potential. Foreign samples were purchased and studied, including German light designs during the years when Moscow and Weimar still found reasons to talk. None of that solved the industrial problem. A light machine gun the Red Army could not produce in Russian plants was a museum piece. Degtyarev's answer was not elegant brochure engineering. It was a gas-operated gun with a locking system built around flapper locks, hinged locking lugs that cam out into the receiver, a layout he would return to for the rest of his life. For feed, he rejected the cloth belts that turned into frozen ropes in a Russian winter, and the box magazines that fought the rimmed case. He put the ammunition in a flat pan on top of the receiver. 47 rounds, ugly to some eyes, obvious to anyone who had watched rimmed cartridges climb a vertical stack. Testers found plenty to hate. The pan was bulky, it caught on kit, it rattled, it was slow to reload under fire compared with a spare box mag slammed home. All of that was true. It also worked. In 1927, the Red Army adopted the weapon as the 7.62mm handheld machine gun model 1927. History would know it by shorter names: DP, DP-27, DP-28, depending on who was translating and which acceptance date they favored. What mattered in the field was simpler. For the first time, Soviet infantry had a true light machine gun designed around their cartridge, their factories, and their war assumptions. Degtyarev did not stop at the bipod version. The same year brought the DEET for tanks. In 1928 came aircraft variants, the Da and Da-2. The pattern was set early. One locking system, one industrial family, multiple mounts. That is how a design bureau becomes a factory doctrine. Kovrov was no longer a failed Madsen site. It was a machine gun plant with a payroll justified by adoption. Degtyarev was no longer invisible. But adoption is only the beginning. The pangun still had to survive contact with the entire world, and the floors still had to prove they could build enough of them to matter. Chapter 3. The Pan That Fed an Army. Chapter 3. The Pan That Fed an Army. The DP was not the best light machine gun of the interwar world by every technical scorecard. It did not need to be. It needed to be good enough to train on, cheap enough to build, and tough enough to live in places where manuals froze shut. Unloaded, it sat around 9 kilograms. Loaded, more like 11.5. Rate of fire roughly 550 rounds per minute. Effective practical fire far below the theoretical number, as with every automatic weapon whose barrel and ammunition supply are finite. The Pan magazine gave the gun its silhouette and its nickname in more than one language. Soldiers called it the record player. The joke wrote itself. Under that Pan was a design philosophy the Soviet system rewarded, and a production philosophy Degtyarev never stopped defending. Long stroke gas piston. Open bolt. Relatively few parts that demanded watchmaker fits. Flapper locking that could be produced and repaired by men who were not Swiss technicians. When something broke in a DP, a unit armorer often still had a gun. When something broke in a more refined foreign rival, a unit sometimes had a club. That difference is not romance. It is spare parts doctrine written into the receiver. It is also why Kovrov's workforce learned a craft that later programs would inherit. The DP went to Spain. It went to Khalkhin Gol. It went into the Winter War, where Finnish troops captured enough of them to make the Soviet gun a familiar problem on both sides of the wire. By the summer of 1944, Finnish frontline counts showed thousands of captured Degtyarevs in use alongside their own Lahti Salarantas. That is a certain kind of compliment. Nobody keeps a useless enemy weapon at the front. Inside the Red Army, the DP became furniture. It was the squad's automatic voice. Film, posters, and later every archive reel of the Eastern Front repeated the same outline: bipod legs, fat pan, flat Russian helmet behind the sights. Variants put the same mechanism into tank bows and coaxial mounts. If you rode a T-34, Degtyarev's work was in the hull with you. Kovrov was no longer proving it could design. It was proving it could supply. It was not sacred. After June 1941, complaint mail from the front stacked up in the usual channels. Pans dented. Feed balked when dirt got into the wrong places. The recoil spring under the barrel heated and lost temper during long firing strings. The plant did not scrap the family. It modernized under pressure. In 1943-44, the design returned as the DPM, stronger bipod. Recoil spring moved back into a tube, projecting from the rear of the receiver, where heat from the barrel could not ruin it as quickly. In 1946 came the ARP-46, a company-level evolution that finally put a belt on a Degtyarev light gun and hung a heavier barrel on the system for sustained fire. Those upgrades matter. They prove the DP was a living tool, not a relic frozen in 1927. But the deeper truth is harsher. The pan gun's real achievement was not perfection. it was presence. Roughly 800,000 DP pattern guns were built across the production life of the family. That number is logistics in steel. It is training manuals, spare pans, depot shelves, and a generation of Soviet NCOs who learned automatic fire on one set of controls. It also made Degtyarev a field word, not only a personnel file. The plant that had begun as an unfinished foreign project now had a reputation worth defending and political capital to bid on heavier problems. While the DP was still the infantry's daily weapon, the sky and the thin armor of the 1930s were laughing at rifle-caliber fire. The factory's next decision would put a much larger hole in the world and tie Degtyarev's name to another man's feed. Chapter 4, 12.7. Chapter 4, 12.7. Heavy machine guns are arguments about physics dressed up as procurement. In the late 1920s and 1930s, every serious military-watched aircraft get faster, and tanks pick up armor that laughed at ordinary rifle rounds. The answer, in several countries at once, was a large-caliber machine gun, something between a rifle and a cannon, able to reach up into airframes and into light armor with the same belt. Degtyarev's first large-caliber effort was the DK, the Degtyarev Krupnokaliberny. The bones of a 12.7mm gun were there. The feed was not. A heavy gun that cannot drink a belt is a loud sculpture. Kovrov did not throw the gun away. It fixed the part that failed. In 1938, Georgy Shpagin, another talent of the Kovrov school, whose name would soon be stamped on a different kind of legend, redesigned the feed into a rotary system that could pull a metal belt with authority. The marriage of Degtyarev's gun and Shpagin's feed became the DSHK, Degtyarev Shpagin Krupnokaliberny. Adopted at the end of the 1930s, chambered for 12.7 by 108mm, the DSHK was the Soviet Union's answer to the same question John Browning had answered with the M2. Two different engineering cultures, one strategic problem, two names on one weapon, and that fact matters for the factory story. Kovrov's real product was becoming a bench culture. Men who could take a locked design, find the part that failed in mud or ice, and file the future into it. Degtyarev's influence here was not only the receiver, it was the insistence that the gun serve the mount, and the mount serve the army, even if another engineer had to finish the belt. Early war production was painfully small. Only about 9,000 DSHKs were built during the Great Patriotic War itself, a reminder that a design can be correct and still lose years to industry, tooling, and competing priorities. Those guns that did exist earned their keep on anti-aircraft mounts, trucks, armored vehicles, and anywhere a commander needed a heavy bullet and a long reach. On the backs of later tanks and in the cupolas of heavy vehicles, the silhouette became as Soviet as the Red Star. After the war, the gun was refined into the DSHKM, and production stretched across decades and borders. Total DSHK family manufacture in Soviet and licensed lines is commonly counted in the high hundreds of thousands to around 1 million. Chinese Type 54s, Eastern Bloc copies, and local rebuilds extended the design into conflicts its drafters never saw. That is the cruel longevity of a good heavy machine gun. The state that ordered it can fall. The belt keeps feeding. For Kovrov, the DSHK did something the DP alone could not. It moved the plant from infantry light gunhouse toward a full automatic spectrum and set up a heavy caliber afterlife that still defines the brand in export footage decades later. But first, the state had to survive a war that turned every inland plant into a frontline institution. The next problem was not a perfect gun. It was weeks, not decades, in a factory ordered to arm millions or watch the map burn. Chapter 5. The Factory Goes to War. Chapter 5. The Factory Goes to War. On the 22nd of June, 1941, the German invasion turned every Soviet defense plant into a frontline institution, whether the front had reached it or not. Kovrov was inland. That did not make it safe. It made it necessary. Plant number 2 of the People's Commissariat of Armament, the administrative name that sat on the Kovrov works, had to throw away peacetime tempo. Design bureaus and production halls collapsed into a single emergency. Steel and tooling moved by decree. The workforce stretched under conscription and exhaustion. Product mix shifted month by month under State Defense Committee pressure. Old schedules meant nothing by July. Vasily Dekhtyarev, now a decorated senior figure and soon a major general of the Engineering Artillery Service, did what the moment demanded. He designed for the week, not the decade. That was still his philosophy, only louder. The Purd 41 was the clearest example. A 14.5 millimeter anti-tank rifle, single shot, long as a fence post, and simple as a bolt action with a vicious cartridge. It was not a miracle weapon. By 1943, heavy German armor had moved out of its comfortable kill envelope. But in 1941 and 1942, when thin-skinned vehicles and the sides of early tanks still populated the battlefield, anti-tank rifles were what a rifle battalion could actually carry. Official plant history still records the first Degtyarev anti-tank rifles leaving Kovrov in October 1941 for the defense of Moscow. Production figures from the early war years run into the tens and then hundreds of thousands across the Purd program. The gun was a stopgap. Stopgaps win months. Months decide wars. For the company, the Purd proved something as important as armor penetration. Kovrov could pivot an entire product line under invasion pressure and still hit the capital's survival narrative with steel that left the gate on time. At the same time, another Kovrov graduate of the Degtyarev ecosystem was rewriting close combat. Georgy Shpagain's PPS-41 submachine gun, adopted in December 1940, was built for stamping and speed. Chrome-lined barrel where possible, drum magazine in the early imagination of the war, later box magazines as industry caught up. The PPS was not a Kovrov exclusive for long. The whole point was that many plants could make it, but the design's roots and early industrial story run straight through the Kovrov school. Across the Soviet Union, wartime and immediate post-war production pushed the PPS family towards 6 million guns. No polished bolt-action tradition survives contact with that kind of output. Simplify, stamp, reduce skilled machining hours. Accept a weapon a conscript could learn in days. Put it in his hands before the next offensive order arrived. Kovrov was no longer only a precision machine gun works. It was a node in a national stamping civilization. The wartime floors also fed the older children of the design bureau. DP and DET machine guns. Aircraft guns. Later in the war, Goryanov's SG-43 medium machine gun entered the story as the Army tried to replace aging Maxims with something made for modern production. Another reminder that the factory's greatness was becoming a roster, not a single signature. The plant collected the decorations the Soviet state gave to factories that mattered, the Order of the Red Banner of Labor in 1942, the Order of Lenin in 1945. Degtyarev himself collected Stalin prizes the way the plant collected orders, 1941, 1942, 1944, and one more after his death. He joined the Communist Party in 1941, weeks into the invasion, a detail that tells you less about ideology than about where every public life was expected to stand when the state was fighting for survival. By 1945, the unfinished Madsen project of 1916 had become something the Danish engineers would not have recognized. Not a single product, foreign franchise. A Soviet weapons city node, a place where a light machine gun, a heavy machine gun, an anti-tank rifle, and the industrial habits behind a submachine gun flood could all be spoken about in the same corridor. Then the shooting in Europe stopped, and the harder question arrived. What does a machine gun plant do when the emergency order book thins and the next cartridge is about to make the old full-power light gun look like yesterday? Chapter 6. The Intermediate Cartridge. Chapter 6. The intermediate cartridge. The Second World War ended with a lesson every army paid for in blood. Full-power rifle cartridges were excellent at punishing men at 800 meters and miserable at being controlled in automatic fire by exhausted infantry under 300. The Germans had shown the intermediate cartridge in numbers. The Soviets had captured enough evidence to stop arguing about the concept. Out of that argument came the 7.62 by 39 millimeter round, and with it a new requirement, a light machine gun that lived in the same ammunition family as the assault rifle. In 1943-44, 3 design lines competed: Degtyarev, Simonov, Sudayev. Degtyarev's gun won the fight that mattered. Adopted as the RPD Ruchnoy Pulemyot Degtyaryova, it took his long experience with gas systems and flapper locking and married it to a belt fed from a drum-like container holding 100 rounds of intermediate ammunition. Empty weight, around 7.5 kilograms, shorter than the old DP. Built to move with a squad rather than anchor a company line, you can feel Degtyarev's old rule inside it. Solve the Army's actual round. Do not invent a fantasy cartridge on the drawing board. Make the feed ugly if it must be. Make it run. The RPD was ready late in the war in prototype terms, but large-scale issue waited. Formal adoption landed in the late 1940s, with heavy deliveries in the early 1950s. Timing made the gun a Cold War weapon more than a Berlin 1945 weapon. That may have been its true historical role. In Korea, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and across a dozen proxy fights, the RPD and its Chinese Type 56 cousin became the automatic backbone of forces that would never see a DP pan except in a museum. For Kovrov, the new cartridge meant new barrels, new belts, new training, new depot math. The plant had to retool habits built around 54 rim pans into intermediate belts without throwing away the workforce's Degtyarev muscle memory. The RPD extended his personal design reign into the assault rifle era and gave the factory a ticket into post-war squad doctrine before the later RPK world fully arrived. In Vietnam, the RPD was not a curiosity. It was standard. American crews learned its sound the way an earlier generation had learned the MG-42s. The gun's limitations were real quick change barrels were not its gift to the world, and sustained fire had limits, but as a squad automatic weapon ahead of its Western equivalents, it did the job the cartridge asked of it. Back in Kovrov, the RPD was also a torch pass. It was Degtyarev's last great production machine gun family, designed as the man himself was aging out of the decade he had dominated. The plant could build it. The doctrine could absorb it. The next universal machine gun, though, would not wear his initials. That fact did not remove Kovrov from the story. It only changed what kind of credit the factory received. The man himself was running out of decade. The next reorganization would put his name on the gate and then force the factory to live without his hands on the bench. Chapter 7. The Name on the Gate. Chapter 7. The Name on the Gate. Vasily Degtyarev died on the 16th of January, 1949, in Moscow. He was 69. They buried him in Kovrov. Within the Soviet administrative machine, death is sometimes the moment a career becomes a place. By decision of the Council of Ministers, Plant No. 2 took his name. The enterprise that had begun as a Danish Madsen project and run for years under faceless commissariat numbers became the factory named for V. A. Degtyarev, Zadi, in the shorthand that still marks the letterhead. It is worth sitting with that. Factories are usually named for political saints or dead commanders. This one was named for a working designer who had started as a Tula benchhand. The honor was real. So was the burden. From 1949 on, every success and every failure at Kovrov would be read, fairly or not, as a verdict on Degtyarev's inheritance. Kovrov was no longer the plant where Degtyarev works. It was Degtyarev's plant, whether he was alive to argue with the drawings or not. The 1950s and early 1960s reorganized Soviet automatic fire again. The AK family owned the rifle roll. The RPK would eventually own the magazine-fed squad automatic roll in 7.62 by 39 and later in 5.45. For a true general-purpose machine gun in the old full-power 7, 62 by 54R, the Army wanted one system that could fire from bipod or tripod, armor or infantry, without dragging Maxim era weight into the nuclear age. The winner of that fight was Mikhail Kalashnikov's PK, adopted in 1961, refined as the PKM in 1969. The PK's design story belongs to Kalashnikov's bureau and to a competition that also involved other serious teams, including Nikitin and Sokolov. Kovrov's role shifted, as great plants often do after their founding genius dies, from sole author to indispensable maker and iterative home. That was a company decision as stark as any wartime pivot. Manufacture, improve, industrialize, do not sulk because the initials changed. The arsenals that insist every gun must be invented in-house eventually become museums. The ones that can manufacture other men's good ideas remain on the budget line. In later decades, the Degtyarev plant's product lists still read like a roll call of late Soviet and Russian automatic firepower. PKM, the PKP Pekineg with its forced air cooled barrel and long barrel life. The Cord 12.7 that finally gave Russian forces a modern heavy machine gun to succeed the DSHK line in first-line service, grenade launchers, anti-tank systems, specialty rifles. Degtyarev's philosophy still shows up in the plant's better habits, even when the drawings are someone else's durability over delicacy, production reality over brochure perfection, feed systems that survive dirt. The name on the gate had become a quality expectation, not only a biography. That is a different kind of glory than 1927. It is also how arsenals actually survive. Kovrov had been the author. It became the machine. But a pure gun plant is a hostage to peace. The next crisis would not be a German army group. It would be empty order books and cold shops. Chapter 8. Motorcycles and Missiles. Chapter 8. Motorcycles and Missiles. A pure gun plant is a hostage to peace. Soviet planners knew it. After Stalin's war, the same industrial logic that had stamped PPS receivers demanded civilian load for the floors and the payroll. At Kovrov, that pressure produced one of the stranger double lives in the arms world. The factory that cut heavy barrels, also built motorcycles under names ordinary citizens, actually spoke, including the Voskhod line. By 1989, the Degtyarev plant was the fourth largest motorcycle producer in the Soviet Union. Mopeds, small tractors, batteries, sewing equipment, the catalog of a defense enterprise trying not to drown every time the procurement tide went out. None of that made the war work gentle. From 1959, the plant was drawn into missile and air defense-related production, including work connected to guidance assemblies, and later man-portable, and vehicle systems that sat far from Degtyarev's flapper locks, anti-tank guided missiles, rocket-propelled grenades in various family marks, automatic grenade launchers such as the AGS-30, naval and special purpose guns. The modern ZID product board looks less like a 1920s machine gun shop and more like a miniature defense ministry. This is the part romantic weapons histories skip. The romantic version wants a lone genius and a single immortal gun. The institutional version is a plant manager staring at floor space, measured in hectares, and asking what earns hard rubles when the army is not mobilizing. Kovrov's answer, across the late Soviet decades, was to become a hybrid, strategic manufacturer up front, civilian machine builder in the annex, design bureaus still somewhere in the maze. Degtyarev never designed a moped, but his plant's original sin and virtue was the same: keep the floors working. The Madsen collapse had taught that empty machine beds are a kind of death. The hybrid taught managers to measure success in mixed revenue and bought survival time between small arms peaks, at the risk of diluting what the name meant. The hybrid worked as long as the Union worked. Then the Union stopped, and the factory faced a crisis no wartime decoration could fix. Chapter 9. After the Empire. Chapter 9. After the Empire. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, defense plants did not receive a soft landing. They received unpaid invoices, broken cooperation chains, in a market that had no idea what to do with a surplus of machine gun capacity. Zidi reorganized in the early 1990s as an open joint stock company still bearing Degtyarev's name. That letterhead did not pay salaries by itself. Across the decade, the plant did what surviving Russian defense enterprises did. It chased export certificates, civilian products, and any contract that converted metal into wages. Official histories and local memory from the period describe the same turn familiar from a dozen other towns: motor blocks, lawn equipment, scooters, ATV experiments, licensed small engines. The 1998 financial crash hammered the country again and forced another round of restructuring. It would be easy to tell that era as pure decline. Easy and incomplete because the weapons side did not actually die. It narrowed, specialized, and waited for the state to remember why Kovrov existed. The Cord heavy machine gun, accepted in the late 1990s, gave Russian forces a homegrown 12.7mm gun designed for modern mounts and metallurgy. The PKM took the PKM lineage and pushed barrel life and sustained fire behavior for troops who still carried 7.62 by 54R into the 21st century. Grenade launchers and anti-armor systems kept design teams employed on problems Degtyarev would have recognized only in the abstract: hit a vehicle, suppress a block of flats, keep firing when the first barrel group is cooking. Those guns mattered for more than doctrine. They were proof that Kovrov could still design modern automatic fire, not only curate memory, and they anchored contracts in years when civilian humiliation and defense prestige had to share the same balance sheet. Ownership folded into the new Russian defense architecture. Today, the Degtyarev plant sits in the orbit of high-precision systems under the Rostec State Corporation, the post-Soviet answer to the old commissariats, wearing a corporate badge. The main entrance in Kovrov still photographs like a Soviet postcard: institutional stone, industrial weather, a name in metal letters. Out in the world, the old guns refuse to retire on Moscow's schedule. DP pans turn up in conflicts where logistics are a rumor. DSHKs hammer away from truck beds in wars fought by men born after Degtyarev died. RPD drums surface in Africa and Asia. PK pattern guns are so common, they have become a visual default for modern machine gun in half the planet's footage. A factory's true production run is not only what it assembles this year, it is what it taught the world to copy, capture, and keep shooting. Every named arsenal eventually faces the same open question: are we a museum with a machine shop, or a machine shop with a museum? The pattern underneath all of it was already a century old. Chapter 10. What the plant actually made. Chapter 10. What the plant actually made. There is a pattern in this story, and it does not flatter easy slogans. Every time Kovrov led, it led by solving a Russian problem with a Russian constraint. The DP accepted the rimmed cartridge and the pan and gave the plant a reason to exist. The DSHK put serious caliber on a mount the Army could train and made collaboration a factory product. The Purd was ugly, long, and available when Moscow's approaches needed anything that could crack armor. The wartime production culture behind the PPS flood treated stamping as a weapon and turned the plant into a node of national output. The RPD carried the intermediate cartridge into the squad before most of the world had language for a squad automatic weapon. The PKM, the PKM, and the Cord proved the name on the gate could outlive the man at the bench. Every time the wider system hesitated foreign cartridge dreams over complex light maxims, peacetime complacency. Post-Soviet industrial freefall, the cost showed up later in crashed programs, emergency designs, or civilian sidelines that had nothing to do with why the plant was founded. Degtyarev the man was not a mystic. He was a Tula worker with a ferocious practical streak, promoted by results in a state that could be lethal to failures. His disagreements were usually with fantasy. His patents and prizes were receipts. His legacy is not a bronze posture. It is a rule still audible in better Kovrov habits. Build the gun the army can actually make. Degtyarev the factory is larger than the man. It is Fedorov's early automatic vision, Shpaghin's feed and submachine gun industrial genius, Goryunov's medium gun, Vladimirov's heavy systems, post-war missile work, Kalashnikov pattern manufacture, and the anonymous machinists who hit quotas in 1942 when the maps were on fire, motorcycle fitters who kept lights on in years when belts were not enough. The plant was founded to build a Danish light machine gun for a Tsar. It became the bench where the Soviet Union learned to think in belts, pans, drums, and stamped receivers. It lost its first owners, its founding designer, its empire, and entire product lines. It kept the name. Today, more than 100 years after the 1916 foundation date, the enterprise in Kovrov still sits at the intersection of Russian small arms and heavier precision weapons, under a state corporation the founders could not have imagined, making systems for conflicts Degtyarev never named. The Voskhod motorcycles and the emergency civilian gadgets were not a betrayal of that history. They were the price of keeping the floors warm until the next order book arrived. If you want to understand how a weapons plant becomes a country's automatic fire memory, how one unfinished foreign project turns into a century of pans, belts, and heavy bullets, you do not start with a museum label. You start with a failed Madsen line in a railway town, a gunsmith from Tula walking through the door in 1918, and a simple institutional decision repeated for decades: build the gun the army can actually make. Then make so many that history has to learn their shapes by heart. The factory behind the Soviet Union's deadliest machine guns was never only steel and proof marks. It was a way of turning shortage into doctrine. And that doctrine, for better and worse, is still out there feeding, locking, and firing long after the men who drew the first blueprints went into the Kovrov ground.